Fab. And so just to give a little bit of an understanding of what we're going to do in this workshop. So as you mentioned, this is the third in a series. So there's a series of four workshops, and this is kind of coming in the middle. So in the first session, we looked at the project so far, Language for All, and what we've been doing as part of it. We'll look at a little bit of that in this session too. Um, in the second session, then we looked at kind of the landscape of LGBT rights broadly in Europe and kind of what we mean when we talk about LGBT rights. What are the kind of frontline areas or issues especially emerging at the moment in Europe. And in this session, then we're going to look at what that means within the classroom. So how we can improve respect, understanding, and inclusion across the ELE kind of classroom and across the curriculum. What this might look like in the classroom. So what kind of challenges LGBTQ plus learners might face in the classroom, what might come up for students within the classroom context, and then how we can respond to that as ELE staff. So, like what kind of supports people might need, and how you can be best equipped as ELE professionals to to support your LGBTQ plus learners, and to I suppose tackle or maybe deal with any challenges that might come up, or even just any questions that might come up too. So I wanted then to, just to take us a little bit through kind of what has brought us to this point in the project. For folks who were at our first session, and I see there's a few familiar names here. So for folks who were at our first session, you would be kind of familiar with this, that we, as part of this project, we ran a survey for ELE staff and workers to kind of assess what they know or what the support needs are in terms of supporting LGBTQ plus students in the classroom. So in terms, and we in that survey we looked at what was coming up for people in the classroom, but then also around the inclusivity of the materials. So we pulled out a few of the kind of key findings from that here for this session. And today we're going to be looking specifically at the materials. So one of the questions that we asked was, did respondents to the survey, who were teachers or school directors or otherwise working in an ELE context, did they consider classroom materials that their organization used to be LGBTQ plus inclusive? And just under half, so like 43 or 44%, said that their classroom materials were not inclusive at all. And then another quarter said that their materials were somewhat inclusive. So the vast majority of respondents said that it was either not inclusive or only a little bit inclusive. And then there was another quarter of respondents who said that they just didn't know if their materials were inclusive or not. And then only 4.7, so just under 5%, said that their classroom materials were very inclusive. So I suppose what that taught us through this survey was that there's kind of two twin issues. One is that a good proportion of people don't know if their materials are inclusive and don't know what an inclusive material might look like or what an inclusive lesson might look like. And then a good proportion of people found that their materials were actively like not inclusive. So maybe not promoting any harmful kind of viewpoints, but just not really including LGBTQ plus people in the learning within the classroom. Um, so that's kind of informed the work that we're doing here, that there's on one hand a sort of a lack of knowledge and understanding piece, and then there's the work that we need to do to really proactively be including people in the classroom. And then the other question that we asked around the materials was whether the survey respondents used or know of additional materials that they find to be inclusive. So where there's like an issue maybe with the kind of core materials that people are using, if folks are using additional materials, are those inclusive or do they know where to find materials that are inclusive? And as you can see, the vast majority, 80%, do not use additional materials that are inclusive or don't know where to find them. And again, only 20% did. So again, that kind of spoke to us pointed us, I suppose, towards what we need to be doing with this workshop series around informing people, giving people the resources and the tools that they need to be more informed, to be more educated, and to be able to kind of be a leader in this space, I guess, in the classroom.
So the first thing we're going to look at are kind of what challenges might learners face. And this was some of the ones that we've come up with together as a group organizing these workshops. So the first one we came up with was exclusion. So they might find themselves outside of the kind of main groups, kind of social groups that we see both in and out of the classroom, right? They might be recipients of slurs or hurtful jokes that happen between classmates. So the use of certain terms and slurs that are used often to describe the community kind of being used as jokes that are oftentimes, if not always, hurtful. There might be a sense of awkwardness that they might face, not liking to kind of the attention that they get or the questions they might be asked or certain things like that. Mainly, and the one that we kind of are also here to talk about is the lack of representation, right? If we look in the classrooms and we look at our materials, like Dara mentioned earlier, with how the fact that a majority of people either say that their teachers and stuff say that their materials are not inclusive, somewhat inclusive, or that they're not sure. That oftentimes leaves the space for the traditional relationships, the traditional heterosexual relationships, to kind of overtake this language learning and take over class discussion, which oftentimes leads anybody of any minority group, whether that be LGBT or a different religion or different ability, just feeling unrepresented. They might also be recipients of misgendering um, or the purposeful use of wrong pronouns. This is something that can cause a lot of internal, like emotional and mental distress on a person, especially if they've corrected their classmates or their teachers before, and it's just not being respected. That's going to be something that causes them to not feel welcome or safe in that classroom and in that environment. And then following that, we have dead naming. If you are unfamiliar with what dead naming is the term that is used to describe using the birth name, the name that's on that birth certificate of somebody who identifies as transgender. Oftentimes, those names are changed to their proper true name that they that they have chosen themselves, and using that birth name is considered dead naming, which oftentimes, again, same thing with the misgendering, causes a lot of issue can cause a lot of issues for individuals, both mentally and emotionally. Um, and then finally, the biggest one that we oftentimes see here, right? We're teaching in language schools where we have people coming in from all over the world, is different cultures clashing. Um, Now, this isn't necessarily something that is done on purpose or something that is done with awareness from these groups, but sometimes different cultures clash, and we might have students coming in from a more traditional background, a more traditionally conservative background, where being part of the LGBT community openly is not something that is really looked at in a positive light. And this aspect can cause some challenges for our LGBTQ learners in the classroom. So just some supports we can provide. These are just things that we've thought about here, is positive inclusion, right? So basics, just like on the level ground here, we have readings, listenings, speaking topics, example sentences, using these, making sure that we're choosing ones that are inclusive to the LGBT community. And we'll talk a little bit about this in a couple minutes here at a later slide. But positive inclusion can also include having pronouns on the name tags of our teachers, having pronouns in our email signatures, allowing students to identify and pick their own to pick their pronouns as they are doing their intake forms, so teachers can be made aware of something, of a student's correct pronouns. Another thing that we can do as teachers and as English language education staff is to ensure accepting and inclusive language is used in the classroom as well as in the school. So we need to stop all use of slurs, right? We I feel like that's kind of almost the straightforward one. Um, we don't need to be using these slurs. We also don't need to, we're not we should not be allowing hateful jokes to be used in the classroom. It does not matter if that student says, oh, it was just a joke. If it hurts a student, or if you have students in there that identify as different minority groups, making jokes about that group in between classmates is not something that we should be allowing. That is ostracizing that group, that minority group, and being LGBT in a classroom. Something like that is oftentimes being used between classmates, and it just kind of makes you feel awkward. And then there's also the politely redirect students who misuse terms and misuse pronouns. The key word there is politely. Um, Oftentimes, such as the case of cultures clashing, they might not be aware of what they're doing. They might not have the education or the knowledge of how to use these things. They might not know how to properly say things. And rather than making them feel bad or to start an argument, we politely redirect, we politely correct and redirect. And doing that is the best way in a classroom to kind of just continue keeping that community, but also making sure nobody's ostracized from that community. And then finally, and a big one is be aware of boundaries. The main thing is to avoid drawing unnecessary attention to LGBTQ plus students um, that they haven't asked for, right? You shouldn't be like, if they correct you on their name or something in the register, you don't need to be like, oh, but it says here. So like kind of it's just a okay, absolutely change it in the thing. If you need to have more information or ask about it late, ask more questions. Do so later when it's just you and them, as to not make this an entire classroom thing. Another thing is to be aware of how open the student is publicly. This is a very big aspect when it comes to LGBTQ students. Um, they might not be open to their parents or to their agents or to their host families or to other people. And it's very important and it's very pivotal that we as teachers who they will trust are aware of these boundaries and make sure that we follow these to not put them in an uncomfortable and potentially unsafe situation. To look at specifically now, um, how to improve respect, understanding, and inclusion in the ELE classroom. We decided to split this up between lower levels and then higher or upper levels, just due to the fact that there is different language and different levels of knowledge of the language. So to make this easier. For our lower levels, the main thing was to choose to be inclusive in classroom materials, like I mentioned here earlier. Choose example sentences, readings, and listenings with LGBTQ plus representation. So choose a reading that has a same-sex couple in it. Choose example sentences where she is going home to her wife or something along those lines, right? Just something very small, simple, direct that shows that inclusion and representation without it being too jarring. Um, then it's really important that we teach gender neutral family titles, job titles, etc. Right? It's not, rather than a waiter and waitress, you could teach server. Rather than stewardess or steward, it's air what flight attendant, excuse me. Um, Family titles rather than grandmother, grandfather. Also make sure you're teaching grandparent, sibling, parent. Um, just things like that. Those small little things just allow for representation to be there, and also just to give more vocabulary, which we need to do anyways, and which our goal is. Also, make sure you teach grammar and pronouns in an inclusive way. Teach they, them as a singular pronoun, right? Um, Teach multiple pronouns. So for she, they, he, they users. Very simple. It's just a simple grammar pronoun kind of lesson here. You teach it as you're teaching the rest of your grammar, but it comes more naturally. Um, Using LGBTQ plus references and aspects and lessons so students see themselves be included as well at these lower levels. Really overall at these lower levels, it is key to keep inclusion simple and more direct. They're not going to have the language to do in-depth discussions. They're not going to have the language to read these like news articles that are discussing and arguing and debating about these topics. So at this level, it is very simple. Teaching gender neutral vocabulary, teaching grammar and pronouns in an inclusive way, choosing to more inclusive materials, which we will talk about at our next workshop a bit more as to where to find those and stuff, as well as just making sure you use LGBTQ plus references and aspects in lessons so students don't see themselves discluded and not represented in the classroom. At our higher upper levels, this is where we have some more space, right? We have some more room to really kind of advance this topic here. So for those higher or upper levels, one of the best ideas is bringing in outside resources from the real world and bringing them into our lessons, right? So newspaper articles, you could have them do newspaper article readings with connecting headlines with topics that deal with the LGBTQ plus community, where they have some discussion questions with groups after. We could have conversations on inclusion, representation, equality, and legislation, encouraging that open dialogue, encouraging them to ask questions and really discuss with each other. Obviously, as the teacher, that's going to require you to know both your class, your so what student it to make sure that students are okay if to do this, that there's not going to be any hatred or arguments that come out. Also to just make sure to monitor to make sure everything is being spoken about correctly. But having these conversations is pivotal. They're going to learn, they're going to open up, they're going to talk about stuff, and it allows you to kind of teach vocabulary as you go. You could have them do studies of movies and shows that are inclusive. Um, like I said, in the next workshop, we're going to show you some resources and we can talk about materials that are openly inclusive. And these movies and shows are going to be a part of it. But just showing movies and shows that are inclusive, kind of asking questions about it if they have them, but just having inclusive materials like this. Also, there's going to be continued teaching of grammar and vocabulary as necessary or as asked, right? Our higher levels are always so curious and they're constantly on the pursuit of knowledge and learning. So making sure that you do answer their questions. You teach grammar with they, them as a singular pronoun. We teach the gender neutral terms in vocabulary if they exist. We teach them the terms that are used in the community if it comes up. And then we continue to use those lower level ideas that we just talked about. All this comes down to basically at these higher levels, we can afford to advance the inclusion, advance the equality, and so on and so forth, such as that.